SOC analysts are often overworked and underappreciated. In fact, many consider leaving their jobs or changing careers altogether. Devo recently hosted the 4th annual SOC Analyst Appreciation Day to give analysts long overdue kudos and encourage organizations to improve their job satisfaction and mental well-being. Missed the event? Don't worry. All the presentations and panels are ungated and available on demand. Visit securityweekly.com/Devo to watch. ThreatLocker implements a least privilege approach to cybersecurity, blocking every executable unless specifically authorized by your team. This methodology mitigates ransomware, supply chain attacks, and zero-day exploits and ensures protection for your organization 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. To learn more about how ThreatLocker can help prevent known and unknown threats in your digital environment, safeguard your data and operations from threat actors, and align your organization with respected compliance frameworks, visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. We've added a few people. Mr. Larry Pesci is here with us.
Hi.
Hi. Mr. Lee, yeah, for the audio listeners, he was waving. Mr.
Yes.
Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
Hey, it's good to be here. Good to see all you guys. It's been too long.
That's right. Mr. Sam Bound is here with us as well.
Looks like I picked the wrong week to stop sniffing glue.
Yeah.
Love the
Based on the
airplane
stories. Yep, for sure. We had a couple of stories in common, and I know, Sam, you have to drop just before the end of the show. So probably a good place to start would be the stories that we had in common, which, I mean, we have software. Ideally, I should be able to do this more easily. Instead, I'm scrolling. And, well, we had the one about the Linux virtual machines on Windows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cute.
Like, excuse me.
Yeah, it's cute.
Like, not in the way that you think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, because you can have WSL, which is Linux, on Windows. And I've seen and read things where attackers are utilizing that facility as well. But this is like basically QEMU, the QEMU binary on Windows, executing an image file that is tiny Linux that contains all of the attacker's toolkits and scripts and everything.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty brilliant attack. The thing that amazes me is that they somehow tricked the user into downloading 290 megabytes and running it with social engineering. You know, I would get a clue that something is wrong at that point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you just got to construct your ruse so that the user is expecting a 290 megabyte file. Right?
I guess. Yeah. I remember.
I have lots of erotic pictures to send you.
Well, they must be awfully big erotic pictures.
Right? That's a lot of erotic pictures. Just maybe a video.
You just got to give it the right subject name, real election results.
Yeah, something spicy.
Did you say real erection results?
No, election.
Okay. Almost, but not quite.
Just checking. Just
that close, Larry.
Yeah, it's a pretty cute
So
idea.
it was interesting that
Yeah.
there was like a PowerShell script that eventually ended up running from a shortcut link, like a LNK file that essentially executes QEMU and runs this image in virtualization, but disables the graphical interface, so it just kind of runs quietly in the background. I thought whoever was looking at this, who was looking at this?
Yeah.
It wasn't, because yours came from Bleeping Computer. There was the firm that looked at it, I thought did a really nice job of, Securonics researchers are the ones that uncovered this. But what was amazing about their analysis is they were able to get a copy of essentially the virtual machine, figure out that it's tiny Linux, but then run it with the graphical interface enabled, and they were presented with there was no login screen on it. Like, they were basically just dumped into a shell. I have to find it in my stories.
Yeah.
And I forgot what they said, because the one you want to read is from Securonics. So now I had to find an all 20 of my stories. I can't find it.
There. Let's see here.
It's frustrating.
I think there's a link for this Securonics cron trap in the Bleeping Computer article in like the second paragraph.
Yes.
Or the
because I
third
picked up mine
paragraph,
from yet
excuse me.
a different source, and then that also links to Securonics. Because I want to bring the actual article up because there was a lot of interesting things in here.
Oh yeah.
So you definitely want to get to the source, the original research that was posted. And so they get to the point where they're like, oh, here's the command that you run. And they called qmu.exe fontdiag.exe for good measure. And they ran it with dash no graphic. So they just removed the dash no graphic. And then they were presented with, so let's see, it displays pivot box as the banner. So, and they just dumped them right into the thing. And then they figured out that it was an ash shell, but also had some instructions. Like it was like, hey, type options for special commands. And there were two commands: get host shell and get host user. So they obviously did some linking so that from this virtual machine they could get access to the host file system. But then the attackers, this is my favorite part, left their command history inside the virtual machine. What does that remind you of, Larry? I think there was a capture the flag competition that we did where some
the
script kiddie
second
hacker was like, "Oh, I'll just
the first CCDC event that I ever did. Your second. Yep.
where I was like,
Yep.
oh, the command history is here. And turns out, like, just a note to attackers: leave your command history around because it's super useful for reverse engineering back to what your intentions were, because you can glean a lot from looking at what commands were typed. And so they did that, and then they go through like each command, like similar to the post I wrote this week about Pacific Rim. You get the commands that the attackers ran, and then, I kind of I custom. I don't want to say you don't say train. What is it when you create a GPT? You create a space like in Perplexity. That's what you can train a prompt. I should say train is the wrong word because you're not training the model. No. You're using the model, but you're giving model specific information about
context.
That conversation so that it learns. Thank you, Larry. That's a much better word. It has the context to have a better conversation to get the content you want out of it. So I did one with the context. I did a couple of them recently, right? So if you can like give it resources, it'll give you better information about these commands, as an example. I mean, that was my approach to. Yes, I could read each one of these commands and then go look up every command line switch, or I could use an LLM and it'll just spit back what all of them do in one fell swoop. But then there's also, they had some kind of command and control software on there. What was they called it Cron DX.
Cron DX, the chisel.
It was Chisel.
Yeah.
Chisel is a command and control application. And so they were able to execute that and run that as well.
Cleverly really written in compiled Golang.
Mm-hmm. So yeah. I really like that one. I thought it was I don't know if it's new. Is it really new and novel? I mean, anytime we say something is new and novel, someone is quick to speak up and go, it's not really new and novel.
Wait, this is interesting. It's a fast Chisel is a fast TCP UDP tunnel transported over ODP secured via SSH. It feels like a lot of wrapping, which is cool, and yet it's still fast, which makes I mean it's kind of mind blowing. But yeah, if it's still fast with all that going on, that's pretty awesome.
So I mean, the defensive recommendations were like, well, look for QEMU or whatever, right? But that can get hard.
You know, it's funny. With modern computers anymore, especially the newer ones that don't have a fan, it used to be you could tell something was up because all of a sudden your fan was running when it wouldn't normally be. Except for maybe Paul and Larry, who have the fan running all the time because they use cycles.
Well, I mean, but you have like, Chrome running. Like Chrome's running, and all kinds of resources are being consumed there. Yeah. So
there's some on my work computer, certain scans kick off on the weekend. I can tell they've kicked off because all of a sudden the fans on my computer in my office are running and I'm not touching them. Mm-hmm. But I was just thinking, aside from looking for the processes running, some hints that something's going on like that, they're kind of going away, aren't they? Mm-hmm. And I bet this thing is really efficient, doesn't need a whole lot of power.
Yeah. So they mentioned using Tiny Linux. I thought it'd be interesting to kind of replicate that to see like how small of a VM you could create with Tiny Linux and still have some functionality.
And cool. Scaronix
You could get a lot smaller than that.
The IOCs too.
For sure.
Oh,
It was interesting nonetheless.
yeah.
The other one we had in common is absolutely hilarious. Do we want to do hilarious or do we want to
Yes.
stay more serious?
Hilarious.
You want to do hilarious? Oh my god, this so so the title is, the headline I read was "Fired Disney Worker Accused of Hacking into Restaurant Menus, Replacing Them with Wingdings and False Peanut Allergy Information."
Right.
And I just want to say there's some hilarious things in here. There's also some super dangerous and horrible things
Totally.
in here as well. So I want to point out that while some of the portions of this article I'm going to call out as hilarious, I also want to call out some some of it's downright creepy, and some of it is extremely dangerous. Like people could die, because they changed the menu. So, and this story just kept getting weirder and weirder as you read this story, man. Holy crap. So basically, after a bad breakup, Disney didn't change credentials to their menu system after they fired an employee.
Right.
Then Disney discovered that it had suffered a security breach, uncovered several changes in its menu creation software. This included changing all fonts in the app to the Wingdings symbols font, which made all of the menus unusable. I just want to pause right there and say that's absolutely hilarious, right? Like that's the prank you play on people where you change their Gmail language to Arabic. Yeah, so it's the equivalent of that.
Yeah, but Paul, we should note too that the change to Wingdings was not the first thing that they did. The Wingdings was kind of like we're going to up this and see if we can get caught, and that was arguably the last step that got them
just
got
for the
them
laws.
nailed.
The QR code altering before or after.
Yeah, so they altered the QR code to go to websites calling for a boycott of Israel, which was kind of hacktivism. And then the dangerous one, says potentially dangerous, I'm labeling it dangerous, removal of allergy information from the menu, which is bad.
Right.
Yep.
But
then they also DOSed the menu creator system for 1 to 2 weeks. As a consequence, menu creator was unusable for 1 to 2 weeks, and manual processes had to be introduced by Disney to create menus for its restaurants, which that stinks.
But didn't he also, though, do that after he had managed to get these new menus printed, and they were basically, if they hadn't been found, would have been distributed to all the restaurants?
Yeah, they did.
Great point, Lee. Yeah, they caught it before menus were printed.
Yep, and they caught it specifically because of, from what I remember reading, the allergen information.
Yeah,
which
that
was
was
like
the thing they were catching. I mean,
Yep.
Wingdings, annoying, but whatever. But allergy information, that's the part that could be fatal. And if
it sounds like Disney had other processes and safeguards against that, which is good.
I mean, when I read that, it's like, holy crap, guys, change credentials when people leave.
Oh, but then there was an actual denial of service attack involved in this. So beginning on August 29th, 2024, 14 Disney employees found themselves blocked from accessing their accounts by denial of service attack, which used an automated script to attempt 100,000 logins, causing the accounts to lock out. But this was very targeted denial of service attack because these 14 employees were on the list of the former employee as people that he didn't like. Is kind of how the article described it.
And arguably, I don't know. I could argue that this wasn't intended as a denial of service attack, but he wanted to try to brute force logins for these 14 employees so he could log in as them, make other changes, and they'd have to take the fall for it because it could be tied to their account. In the process, locked out their damn accounts because well, that's not how password brute forcing in the real world works.
But then it gets creepier, because he gets caught on a Ring doorbell visiting one of the homes of the Disney employees, giving was it the thumbs up or the middle finger to the Ring camera, and looking at a package on the doorstep. And that employee realized what had happened, and for safety reasons had to stay in a hotel.
I bet it was a Disney
until
hotel.
they could sort it out. To me, the only good news is this article is that Schuer was the person's name, remains in federal custody, awaiting his motion hearing for bond on November 5th, 2024. I suppose now that that's passed, we could probably, if that bond hearing actually happened and it is public record. We could look it up. I'll leave that as an exercise for someone else right now. But something tells me, I mean, we could potentially get the results from this, but something tells me that once the judge sees the Ring doorbell footage, the likelihood that this person's going to make bail's probably not too high. I don't know. I'm not a judge or a lawyer. I don't pretend to know. All the details of the case would be presented in court, right? But I would think that would work against the defendant in this case.
Well, my complaint is that Disney had a single shared password for many people to use on their menu printing system, and that's a ridiculously poor security policy. That's a practice. I don't think any compliance framework would let you get away with that.
No.
Yeah, Disney messed up by that, Sam, and not changing those credentials, right?
Well, that's why you don't share passwords or user accounts. Everybody has their own user account. Then when you throw somebody out, they're out.
Right. So my question was going to be, was that by design, or is that the only option the menu system provider had, is we'll give one company one account, and that's their model? Now, Disney's big enough to have a little clout on something like that, and they should have pushed back. But I've been there where it's my way or the highway. This is how we offer the service, which
you can still provide it by putting a VPN in front of it, for example.
Yeah, there are ways you could mitigate the risk. I'm not saying you're wrong, Sam.
Yeah.
But where were the limit line? Where were the hard lines that they couldn't cross to do it right?
Yeah.
Because if there weren't any, damn it, guys, you can do better.
Oh, Sam, your article is better than the one that I read, by the way.
Well, it's Joseph Cox, I think. He's always top short. Top notch.
No,
way better than the one I linked to. Read Sam's article on that, which I like how you'll see it in the link. There's some gating that you can get around. Let's just put it that way, so you can read the article. I see what you did there, Sam. I like it.
Well done, Sam.
All right.
So that's the crazy Disney story.
It is.
See, Paul, and when I thought you were going to go with humorous, I thought you were going to talk about the Schneider Electric ransomware.
Oh, I mean, well, while we're on the subject of hilarity, this too is absolutely hilarious. Let me see if I can find my article on it.
What? Paid the ransom in briquettes? Is that? No, baguettes.
Baguettes.
Holy moly, that's a lot of bread.
That's exactly what the article said.
That's exactly what the article said, right?
Oh.
So hackers have demanded France's Schneider Electric pay $125,000 ransom in baguettes. Now,
Paul, story
not
number
so much
16.
interested. Thank you. I'm not so much interested on the breach itself. I don't believe Schneider Electric has confirmed nor denied any breach or details of said breach. I do think Schneider Electric is a great company. I interviewed one of their employees and was impressed in how they handle and validate all of the supply chain and do supply chain security across the organization. But I do want to discuss the hilarity of ransomware threat actors demanding that companies pay the ransom in baguettes, because that is like, first, why? Why would they do that? So we would talk about it, about how hilarious it is. Thanks for the content for the show.
I mean, because this isn't something you can just electronically do. I mean, what? They're supposed to have them set it up to the order to be delivered at what? A drop spot? I mean,
there's a lot of logistics here. Also, how many baguettes does $125,000 buy you?
I suppose it depends on where you get them.
Right, and I was going to say, how do they verify the amount? I mean, if I
France,
think I can get a baguette for $1 and you pay $2 a piece,
are we sure this isn't a name for like a French cryptocurrency?
No. Maybe it was, Jeff. Maybe it was. And this whole article is wrong. They got it all wrong. It's a new cryptocurrency.
Baguette flies under the radar.
So, but what do you do with, I don't know, 125? Let's say they're $1 a piece. Are they $1 a piece? I don't know. Whatever it is.
Let's say they're
about four.
Let's say they're for $125,000 worth of baguettes. Let's say they're $10 a piece. What do you do with 12,500 baguettes?
How many baguettes are too many baguettes is what we're
You're going to
questioning.
throw a hell of a party because
Yeah.
if you don't, they're going to go bad.
Right.
Oh.
That was my next thing was like, how are you going to consume all? Are you going to feed a small country? Maybe they were doing a good thing. Maybe like,
I
you know what,
actually
pay some
think-
bread and we'll go feed the poor.
They weren't going after the payment because there's somewhere in the farther down they mentioned that they could get half the ransom amount if they had publicly admitted to the breach.
Right.
So it feels like they were
$62,500 worth of baguettes if
They were
they
like-
admitted to the breach.
They're going after their reputation.
Still a heck of a lot of dough.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't read the
yeah.
article when I first saw the headline. I chuckled, but I thought, okay, they're not really after the money. They're trying to make some kind of a point.
It's hacktivism again.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is more fun than the traditional refs, and you won't run into OFAC issues for paying that ransom. But
Ooh, it does that. I mean, has that ever been tested? This is the first time I've seen a ransom demand in bread.
yeah,
It's not a bread, it's a baguette.
It's a baguette. Well,
Don't
it's
tell a
baguette.
Frenchman or a Parisian that it's bread.
potato.
Isn't it the thing I get at Panera Bread?
It's
Isn't it a baguette?
It's like a crepe.
Right.
It's not
Isn't
a
it-
pancake.
While you're on the silly stuff,
We're going
might
to
as
do
well.
a gigantic game of light source using baguettes.
A lot of sandwiches. I mean, you make a lot of sandwiches with that. I love sandwiches.
It's a good source of entropy.
Yeah.
You measure the twists of the baguette.
Sorry, Sam.
No, that's fine. While
I
you're
think we're
doing
done with the
silly-
baguette. We've said baguettes more on this
Yeah.
episode than we ever have in the 19-year history of the show.
So
Yep,
now,
yep. Anyway, my number 6 is more of the same nonsense. The Russians fined Google a fine, and they made it double every week.
yes.
And it's been 4 years, so of course it's now some ridiculous huge number. I didn't know anybody was ever
was it
stupid
20
enough to
followed by
actually-
33 zeros?
What is
Yeah.
decillion?
Yes.
Is that how you say that? Decillion?
I have no idea, but it's more than all the money in the world.
DECI?
Yeah.
Decillion, yeah.
Decillion? Is it decillion?
Yeah.
We're going with decillion because it kind of sounds like a Star Trek or Star Wars race, like from some foreign planet. Like
It's
we have to go to
roughly
the planet
equivalent
of
to the
decillions.
national debt. But,
Yeah. No, it's like the global GDP is less
Much less.
than that.
We
Yeah,
better
Like
get
it's
printing
only
some
100
money.
trillion.
So
That's a lot of dough as well.
It's surprising that anybody would actually pass a
Can I get a
quota to
discount
like
if they
that.
pay in baguettes?
How many baguettes is that?
to the
More than
baguettes
you
have
could
to be
manufacture in a
baked?
lifetime.
Yeah, somebody's going to have to rise to the occasion on that one.
I was looking for the punchline in the previous one, and that's it right there, Lee.
Man.
You nailed it.
We better get to it.
Day.
Got to stop loafing around here.
Yeah.
I love it.
So yeah, I mean, this seems like it's just they're making a point because there's no way in hell it's going to pay paid.
They're not making much of a point. Google's just going to ignore it. What else can they do?
And they closed they seized their bank accounts in Russia, but Google's pulled out of the country, so they're going to just walk away from whatever money the Russians have.
And Google couldn't pay it if they wanted to because it would violate sanctions.
Yeah,
That's right.
even if they had the money.
Right. Even if they had an alien race, decillion.
I mean, I guess they're trying to seize other global assets for Google. Russia is, but the courts aren't going for it.
I wonder if you could negotiate a payment plan.
Maybe it's not funny, but moving on. I think Paul and Sam had similar, or if not the same, article about the massive crime industry that's hacking billion-dollar companies. That's the Wired article.
Yeah. The info
Is that,
stealers.
which one is that?
Well, it's my number
Pretty sure you
7.
had it, Paul.
I don't know. I think you probably have it too. It's not a terribly new thing, but it's just the info stealers are getting very powerful. So you can, it's basically crimeware as a service. You buy the info stealer from somebody, they go steal the passwords. You still buy the passwords from somebody who stole them. You can sort of assemble your crime out of pieces you buy from other people.
Oh, I didn't read that one. That's interesting.
Well, I
Yeah,
thought it
and
was
the point
interesting
is-
because they interviewed the Dark X, the alleged perpetrator, and apparently he knocked over Hot Topic, which is a retailer. So I'm like, oh, there must be a PCI angle, but there's not, from what I can tell. They weren't going after credit card information at all. They were mostly going after other things and maybe doing ransomware and malware.
Yeah, well, I think the point is you really need zero trust because anybody in your company could be fooled, and the info stealers will steal everything: session cookies, stored passwords, cryptocurrency keys, and so on. And so you just, as I think we all know, you have to assume that some of the machines inside your network are in fact under hostile control, and then check every request in your network.
Well, isn't there some part of the article where they're talking about they're offering, instead of stealing traditional data like blocks of credit card numbers, they're selling log files?
Those two
log files for sale.
A weird thing to sell.
It is.
But I think the session cookies are the real hot thing. If they're stealing,
although Larry, it was a month or two ago. I was working with a client, and one of the PCI requirements is to review log files, and I was looking at some of the log files, and it's more of a compulsory activity these days. But I'm going through the log files, and all of a sudden I'm seeing credentials. I'm like, shit, are these real? I'm like, holy crap, they're real. And so I had to point it out to the customer. I'm like, you've got credentials in your log files that probably shouldn't be there.
It's true. I mean, it's somewhat luck if an info stealer is grabbing logs and selling them, that there'll be some type of data that an attacker wants in the logs. But I think all of us have seen stuff in logs that shouldn't be there.
Mm-hmm.
Usually that's developers maybe debugging something or whatever, and it ends up in a log file.
Well, I mean, in the old days, everything was in the log files. I can't tell you how many times I found credit card information in log files of routers. Remember routers and switches? When somebody would turn on the promiscuous logging to do some troubleshooting and then never turn it off and never delete any of the logs. And so it was just all there.
Back in the day before we sent credit cards over encrypted channels, encrypted protocols.
Yeah, back in those days. Which to this day, it's still not required internally. But for the most part, we're not sending, plain text credit card credentials around anymore, because more times than not these days, it's encrypted at the card reader. But it's interesting in the Wired article, which I think is the one that Sam posted. It talks about some of the data that they collected was emails and addresses and phone numbers and partial credit numbers. That's code for last 4 digits, because that's all that most people have anymore.
Sam, we did have the article about Pacific Rim and Sophos's 5-year battle with.
I was on vacation. Catch me up on this whole thing.
So Larry and I and Evan Dornbush from Hackers on the Rocks podcast did an episode of Below the Surface where we talked about this for an hour. And so Larry and I are tired of talking about it.
I don't know about that.
I'm just kidding.
We definitely need to give some highlights here, Paul, because we came up with a bunch of stuff. And the irony is that I picked up Sec 556 on an emergency basis to teach today and the remainder of the week. And this actual topic, the stuff that we learned from Pacific Rim, came up in class today about hacking IoT.
For sure.
So, one of the things that we talked about, Paul, in that discussion was the paucity of processing cycles, or with modern IoT and appliances, that processing cycles aren't really a big deal anymore, and we should be able to do all sorts of other endpoint protection on some of this type of stuff because we have so much availability. Hey, I'm getting really far ahead of ourselves about talking about Pacific Rim, but there's so much more that we can do, given that the availability of power on some of these devices is not what it used to be. It's actually much better.
So Jeff, at a high level, Pacific Rim is Sophos's, what do they call it? OPEX team?
Yeah.
Is that what it was called?
Yeah.
Sophos's OPEX team conducted a 5-year, basically, investigation where they observed what would turn out to be Chinese threat actors compromising, in this case, Sophos brand firewalls, and coordinated with other cybersecurity companies, law enforcement, to basically conduct this operation over 5 years. Included in that is what was released on Halloween last week, was much of the tradecraft used by the threat actors, insights into their operation. Some of this information was gathered because they got permission from lawyers to put what they called kernel level implants into customer systems to gain visibility and telemetry into what the attackers were doing. And I believe, I don't know if it calls it out specifically, but the group and location in China where they were operating out of had one of these firewalls, and I believe that kernel level I called it a rootkit.
I was going to say, define a kernel level implant.
It's funny. So I'm listening to the Security Conversations podcast with Ryan Narain, and I forget his co-host name. But they're doing this like new format where the three of them talk about the news, and they're one of the only podcasts that I've listened to recently that are actually talking about this. And they had this exact discussion. I'm at the point where they're having this exact discussion, Jeff, about like what is a kernel level rootkit. And
you're calling it a rootkit, but they called it an implant.
They called it an implant.
It's some sort of malicious code or something.
But one of the hosts of that show was like, I would have never called it anything like that in the report. I would have called it like a telemetry processing patch or something that does not have the word kernel or implant or rootkit associated with it whatsoever, which I kind of agree with. If we read into that, so now we can do a lot of speculation. Largely, that's what we do on podcasts.
That's what we do.
Yep, that's what we do. It was probably a kernel level rootkit, right? Kernel level driver module that lived in the Linux kernel that monitored behavior, like processes, what commands were being run, what the processes run, what were they called, file system activity, what files were being copied to and from the file system. All of that telemetry you can collect from the kernel. You just need a module that goes out and looks for that particular behavior, hooks the right system calls to be. And this is describing exactly what a rootkit does,
right?
It's basically,
that's existing stuff. You're just kind of redirecting it to some place where you can gain access to it, right?
And Paul, it was the fun part about that one was that they got permission from the lawyers, and it was arguably to provide more. Better customer support to their customers that were being under attack to gather some of this telemetry. Right. But some of the devices that they identified under attack were those based in China in the locations observed to be part of these individual set of threat actors.
Correct.
And as part of that, as a customer of or a recipient of a Sophos device, I don't think it was ever really clear whether these threat actors actually bought it legitimately from Sophos or bought a secondhand one. It feels like they bought it first party from Sophos to do the stuff on, so that
or a reseller, or I suppose you could buy a device off eBay and then just license the software and install it on there.
Yep. So arguably they were providing customer support to prevent these to gather telemetry to prevent these types of attacks, but just so happens one of those devices was in possession of the threat actor that was performing the attacks in their test lab, so they had early access.
Which is weird because I want to say in somewhere else in the report. So Jeff, Sophos released like 6 blog posts
all on the same day
on this whole thing, all on the same day, which is weird. But anyway, I thought somewhere in the attack that attackers were disrupting the telemetry communications from Sophos devices that they compromised, so that telemetry data wasn't being sent back. However, since Sophos put the kernel level implant in what likely was their test system in China, where they were testing these exploits in various techniques, the fact that was sending telemetry back, I think was a misstep by the attackers, unless they needed a device to look at the telemetry to be able to figure out how to disable the telemetry. Right. So there's all these kind of like speculative things that we have. I do have strong evidence to believe that it was in fact a physical device and not a virtual device, because they were experimenting with UEFI implants. And in order to do that, you need actual physical hardware, and the flash ROM commands that they ran were interfacing directly with the spy flash on the device. So they would have had to have the actual hardware.
Well, which gets back to the idea of it, an implant. Was that like a physical chip or something that they were able to add to the device?
No, these
or was
are.
it logical? Or was it code?
Yeah, I think it was just I think they just pushed it inside of a firmware update. Perhaps I'm not sure exactly how they did it, but a firmware update would certainly give them the ability to put something in the kernel that could do this level of monitoring.
And if the telemetry was being impacted, it sounds like it was redirecting it rather than just passively capturing it.
So, is there any way
I'm
for
not
us?
sure which they did.
Is
Go
there any
ahead,
way to
Sam.
defend? Is there any way to defend yourself from this? I mean, how do we know that our firewalls we're using aren't infected with something like this?
Well, it depends on how deep the attackers went on the system, and depends which defensive things you want to enable. I think starting at the very top, making sure that you're on the latest firmware is one thing. Then moving down the stack, any kind of monitoring you can put in place, which begs a whole different argument about the visibility and insights we have as users of these devices into what they're doing, is also somewhat limited across the board in all manufacturers in some capacity, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Getting down into the firmware level is hard, because the attackers were able to. You ever PTL hooking? Sam, does that ring a bell?
I have not
Lee,
done it.
anyone?
Yeah.
So yeah, because we talked about it. So basically, when you compile a program, right, and you've got function calls and separate library files, it creates various tables and unique and identifiers for those calling functions, so that it knows which file to go to. And there's an open source tool called PTL Hook that can hook those tables so that the calling function is calling another function by name, but that name doesn't change, so your calling code doesn't have to change. But that function really now just another function is called in its place without the calling function knowing that that's happening.
Oh, well, this is essentially what
So it's
Frida
almost
does.
like a remapper.
Yeah, it's not a new or novel technique. What I think is interesting is what I gleaned from the reports is, I had to do a little reading between the lines, but they hooked the firmware update process in the firmware such that anytime firmware updated and called a function, I don't think they disclosed which function it was, but whatever function it was, they said, well, rather than doing that, do our function, and our function makes copies of our malware on a temporary partition that persists across firmware updates inside of the firmware. So anytime you did a firmware update, the malware would persist, and they did that with that function call hooking.
That's pretty cool.
Which I thought was interesting. They also modified the firmware to get around the cryptographic signatures by replacing the binaries that did the cryptographic signature checking. Right. It's something we've seen in UEFI secure boot bypasses and other lots of other examples, I suppose. But basically, what I think they did was you basically always you swap the binary out so that it always just returns true,
right?
No matter what the firmware changes. I'm just always going to say it passed validation checks, and you can do that by replacing binaries.
You just replace the binary with a link to bin true. I mean, come on.
Exactly. Yep.
Exactly. Yep. And so at the firmware level, that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
Then they went to the UEFI level, but they didn't do secure boot bypasses. They were like, no, they went a step before that, and they just went straight to modifying UEFI firmware on the spy flash device, which if you get in early enough into UEFI, it's before the secure boot code kicks in, and it's where technologies like Intel's boot guard are supposed to prevent tampering of firmware. So in the scenarios that we analyzed at my day job, there's a bunch of different scenarios that could have played out. We tested some devices where boot guard just wasn't enabled. You can't just go enable boot guard. I think we've talked about on the show before, there's a root of trust. Like Intel has keys, your OEM has keys. Keys need to be fused onto chips. It's not something that's user enabled or disabled like secure boot. And so that wasn't enabled on some models that we tested. If it was enabled, 2017 research from Embedi, I believe, which is a Russian country, which is under sanctions right now, which you have to use the Internet Archive to find the original paper, that talks about in Intel boot guard bypass. And in the file names, they kind of made reference to names in the files that referenced names in that research of boot guard bypass. So I guess they were testing boot guard bypasses as well, which is kind of scary. I mean, it's the first time we've seen that kind of UEFI implant in use on a firewall. Because again, these are just PCs. What did we say, Larry? There were PCs with fancy cases and fancy screen printing.
Yep. So it's
Under the covers,
screen.
it's an Intel PC with an AMI BIOS.
Yep.
With all the same hardware architecture. This is basically a PC.
Yep. Harkening back to the days of when the Nokia IP440 chassis was running Paul.com Security Weekly or Paul's Security Weekly for many years.
Right.
Because we had a friend on Facebook that was actually just disposing a bunch of those chassis, right?
Yep. I bought a whole lot of them.
Yep.
Actually, funny story, I bought the same ones that I was administering back in the day. Because I worked for a division of a larger company and they closed that division down. And they decided not to use Nokia firewalls because the main company didn't use Nokia firewalls. And so they're like, well, we're just getting rid of them. I'm like, well, how much you want for them? And I bought a whole boatload of them, a couple of Sun systems for like $150 or something. I don't know what it was.
Pennies on the dollar. Pennies
Yeah.
on the dollar. And I remember you gave one of the cases to me, and I used it for a number of years. And then I actually ended up giving it back to you because you needed a case or something, and I wasn't using it. Yep.
I don't know if we have any left, to be honest with you.
Oh.
There might be one kicking around. I don't know. Anyway. So Jeff, that's the high level on Pacific Rim.
Thank you for catching me up. I appreciate it.
You should also go read all 6 blog posts. Riveting.
I probably won't.
Appreciate your honesty.
There's a blog.
Go read my post on it.
By some numbnuts.
I skimmed through your post. I had a different objection to your. What was the title of your post? Do you remember?
Pacific. It wasn't all over.
Chronicling a 5-year hacking episode.
Yeah, Pacific Rim chronicling a 5-year hacking escapade.
Yeah, it wasn't the title. It was
the kaiju.
I saw Mandy post it or reference it or something on LinkedIn about would you worry about this or would you? I forget what the wording was, but I was kind of like, yeah, I wouldn't worry about that.
I would.
I'd have to look it up.
And it's not just this. My soapbox for a moment, right? For years, we've been collecting evidence, hard and fast evidence, that threat actors are actively targeting firewalls, VPN appliances, IoT routers. I've got a couple more stories even just this week that support that theory. And it's happening for a lot of reasons. One, these are juicy targets. 2, they communicate internet traffic to internal traffic as edge routers. Visibility on these devices is very poor. There's lack of security software that are on these devices. The difficulty in forensics. Sometimes memory protections are missing. As in this case, sometimes basic UEFI and BIOS protections are missing. And part of that's because they're not being monitored as we would monitor any other kind of PC server or laptop. And attackers can compromise a lot of these and use them for all kinds of different purposes. In it, they talked about the ORB, operational relay boxes, right? Not so much command and control systems, but systems that are intended to be able to proxy and route traffic of the attacker's choosing. So not just command and control, but sending files, whatever the case may be. A relay box. We would call them relay boxes, right? Jumping off points.
A proxy, a pivot.
A proxy, pivot point. Yeah. So there's that aspect of it. So I think if you're running any of these appliances, as we've called them, it is cause for concern. You are under attack.
It was your statement on your post, Paul. You begin it with, if you believe you are not a target. I believe I am not a target. But if you're talking about me or the organization, is it the editorial you? Is it the third person you? That might be different. But as we were talking on the previous segment, I don't think most bad guys to this day are targeting specific entities. They're targeting entities that are using stuff that they know how to break and exploit.
Well, they're learning how to break all kinds of things. And you have one of these particular devices that gets on their list, you don't patch it or defend it, you're going to get compromised. And for good measure, as is pointed out in the Pacific Rim attacks, they're just going to harvest some credentials off of there for use for later attacks. So you personally may not be a target, but your devices, your infrastructure, hardware, your software is a target today.
Right.
And that
You
list
may
just
not be the
keeps growing.
target, but your stuff is the target.
Your stuff is the target. Well, I mean, once they're on there, like this was kind of a eye-opening thing. Yes, it's a nation state, but they're just going to grab your credentials, and because then they can just collect all kinds of credentials, and do something else with them later. Your credentials could be useful to accomplish other goals.
Right.
You may not be the goal, but you're a means to an end.
Yep. Like what
in
was
this.
some of the things we used to say, Paul? Like, you may not be a specific target, but you have things that attackers desire. Specifically,
Bingo.
network bandwidth, disk space, and processing power. Like,
or my fear,
but
is the
nobody's
ability
going
to-
after me personally to exploit anything in particular. They might find me because I use a particular technology.
crime of opportunity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
or they might just want to just turn something off someday.
Yep.
They might,
a whole bunch of
but
stuff.
FUD has been part of our industry since the very beginning.
Of course.
And it's and there's some level of security is theater and warm fuzzy feelings, but I still push back on any or most references to FUD where it's trying to trigger an emotional response in me as an individual, because me as an individual is not anybody's target that I'm aware of. It doesn't mean I couldn't be. I'm more of a target of opportunity, but I've been talking to. I asked many people, I am, you guys talk about your home networks and all the defenses you have. I have the standard ISP provided routers and gateways and whatever they've given me. I don't have any additional protections, and I defy anybody to find me. And I ask different pen testers and hackers that I know, how would you go about finding me and targeting me individually in my home office? And I have yet to have somebody come up with anything other than, well, I'd have to send you a phishing email. I'd have to get you to click on something. How are you going to find me in the ocean of the internet these days? I'm not particularly hiding from
people
anybody.
aren't worried about attackers aren't going after Jeff Mann, right?
That's my point.
But let me finish. They don't have lists of everyone that lives here in the United States, and they're not picking off each and every single one of us one by one.
Right.
What they're going after is our infrastructure, the infrastructure that we use. And saying that, like, I'm not a target because they're not targeting Paul Asadorian is not an excuse to go, I'm not gonna defend my stuff, because if it's on the internet, it's being attacked today.
So it's a
it's being
corporate
attacked.
responsibility, corporate ethics type of.
I think it's to a certain extent. We debated in the Below the Surface episode that we can't put the responsibility entirely of security on the end user. So grandma, is not going to be a security expert to defend her cybersecurity position, but there needs to be a shared responsibility that your internet service provider for consumer gear that connects you to the internet should meet a minimum level of security, should have some type of monitoring, should be able to thwart the attacks that we're observing today in the wild by, in this case, Chinese threat actors, Russian, whatever the threat actor is.
Right.
I think we have, again, I think I agree, corporate responsibility to secure the internet today, secure our infrastructure. And let's be honest, our internet is critical infrastructure. If it's taken down because no one is securing their edge router on every consumer internet connection, then that's a huge problem. As evidenced by my story number, other mouse. Where's my TP-Link story? This is exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, my story number 14. So thousands of TP-Link routers are used in a year-long account takeover attacks.
Okay.
So I I think we all have like favorite movies that are really so bad that you like them, and then there's a certain subclass of that that's like, this is my favorite really bad movie that most people don't love, but I love it and I could watch it 117 times. And the 118th time I would still get just as much enjoyment out of it as the first time I watched it. So for me, that movie is How High from 2001 with Method Man and Redman. Don't judge me, okay?
Don't worry, we are.
For me, it's the
Okay,
Blues
that's
Brothers.
late.
But go
All right,
ahead.
fine, judge me. There's a scene in the movie where Method Man says, "You predicted that shit." And what I'm saying is, this is a story where I kind of did predict that. Larry also predicted that. I think we could both point back to materials that we developed and communicated that predicted that. For me, it was my 2010 BrewCon talk, and I linked to a YouTube video of it. So if you don't believe me, you can go watch it. And the title of that talk was "Embedded Devices in My Plot to Embedded Device Security in My Plot to Take Over the World." And I talked about commodity-based routers being used by attackers to conduct operations, to be able to disrupt operations, to be able to conduct other attacks, to be able to profit off of those. So yeah, they don't care about Paul Asadorian, but if I compromise that router and I just monitor that router for, banking information, for credit cards in a generic sense, not the person, but the data,
Right.
they might get that. And now this is coming true because this TP-Link botnet was, I forget how many thousands of them, enough that they can conduct password spraying attacks against, I think it was Azure accounts, estimated about 8,000 strong on average, used to conceal the malicious activity. I forget what the concealment was. They were doing something to kind of mask, like the attack would never come from the same IP, or bounce around within that 8,000.
I'm sure it was
Standard
a
botnet.
Jedi mind trick.
Standard botnet stuff.
Yep.
So and to go back to the point you made with the last article, I mean, this target of opportunity is the TP-Link instead of the Sophos router, right?
Wait, say that again. Sorry.
We were talking about they're going after your stuff, and in that article they were talking about Sophos, but now we got a kit that'll take on these TP-Link routers and turn them into our little botnet. It's the same kind of thing, and of course the purpose of this botnet was to then do password spraying against Office accounts. Office 365.
Correct.
But in both cases, those TP links need to be secured, updated. Don't allow WAN management, please. Change the default password. You could replace TP link with Sophos in that comment and be accurate.
It is similar. We've noticed in the Typhoon campaigns, Lee, to your point, that there is a mixture of vulnerabilities in vendor and products that cross over between, that kind of mix between a consumer IoT device, an enterprise device, a SOHO device, or small, medium enterprise, right? Like, I've spent a lot of time categorize. In fact, I did some categorization of this today. I looked at all of the, this was one of my LLM spaces that I created. You can upload files to, it's basically a space is you give it certain prompts and data, and then you have conversations with it, and it will favor that data and the pre-prompts that you give it, from what I understand. And those that are more experienced in this than I, please chime in. Love to hear from you. So I would give it prompts. The prompts I would put, like, you make sure you use this as a resource. And I would give it one of my blog posts that I chronicled all the Typhoon things, right? And then for data, I would give it downloadable files. So I downloaded the MITRE ATT&CK spreadsheets, the SysAkev spreadsheet, and a couple of PDFs of reports that were published by various entities on these specific campaigns that include all CVEs and all that stuff. So now I have a prompt that's like trained, not trained, it's the wrong word. I have a prompt that has context that allows me to ask questions to give me more of the data that I want, and not just generic stuff that it's pulling from the internet, right? And so I was able to create a table. I'm like, so show me all the CVEs that are associated with all Chinese-based threat actors targeting network devices, IoT devices. And then I'm like, now create a column for if it's on the SysAkev. I'm like, now create a column for from the MITRE attack data on which threat actor group, which technique it was. I'm like, then use all the resources and tell me what threat actor group. And I ended up with, basically a CSV file with about 30 lines in it with all that data populated in it.
Cool.
And then I went through, Lee, back to your point. I went through and I said, what type of device is this? Right. I'm like, is it an enterprise level device? So there was some Cisco stuff on there.
Right.
Nexus switches are enterprise. I mean, that's, provider kind of level gear.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was also Draytech routers and TP-Link routers in that list as well. And then things in between like SonicWall and Sophos, or what I call that Soho kind of small, medium enterprise is kind of where I put them. And so I basically, from the data, I could derive that they're not just targeting small IoT devices and not just it's everything in between. That was my fun project for the week.
That is kind of neat. I mean, I suppose if you know it's a Cisco or Sophos, whatever, no matter what class of device, you might fingerprint it and look up default password, see if you can get in.
Right.
Of course, once you're in, if you don't have an exploit for that, well, okay.
Well, and so that's what Pacific Rim was talking about, was the group in China was acquiring these devices, doing the vulnerability and exploit research, coming up with a 0-day, submitting that to a Chinese bug bounty program, getting paid out for it. That Chinese entity then was taking that O-day and and giving it as basically a weapon to maybe internal groups within China, and certainly maybe contractors that were doing that work on their behalf to go accomplish the goals of the nation state threat actors, right?
Neat.
And so they basically have this engine that's churning, is finding these 0-day exploits and operationalizing them within the country.
Yeah. Part of this comes back to, once they have these devices, what do you do? It comes back to Sam's comment about zero trust. While I hate the name zero trust, what it's about is actually pretty cool, because you're no longer trusting the network or devices or just password. You're using strong authentication. You're using encryption. You're using device signaling for health and all that stuff. I mean, it's a ton of technology that isn't necessarily a finger snap to implement, but when you're there, it's not logging in with your father's password anymore. And that's a really nice place to be, because but we can prioritize that. Multi-factor authentication on a password spraying account is going to help a lot.
Well, I think there's also, Lee, to your point, zero trust architecture that has to be built into the devices themselves.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So enabling things like boot guard and secure boot speak to a zero trust architecture, because you're cryptographically verifying each component that's loading when the device boots up to make sure it actually is the component that it says it is, that it's, hasn't been, backdoor tampered with or have vulnerabilities in it on a revocation list, right?
Discovered vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Captain Obvious moment, this is defense in depth.
Well, and also I think there's zero trust architecture to the software processes as well.
Yeah.
If you look at, we've got another example of an authentication bypass that goes to command injection vulnerability. If you're applying a zero trust architecture to the software stack, that particular functionality in the software should never ever be executing a command, because that violates my zero trust architecture. Then that should stop it as well, which is interesting. I have to give a presentation on zero trust on Friday.
So just because I hate marketing buzzwords, anybody give me a succinct definition of zero trust in this context.
There's no trust, meaning zero trust. Sorry. Trust no one. Trust no one. Trust no one.
Trust no one. That's fine.
No, I think it means that every time you get a
Tune
request
in on Friday.
to access,
Tune in on Friday.
Yeah. But I mean, every time you get a request to access a network resource, you evaluate it to see if it's suspicious before you honor it. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's not just one factor.
Yeah. Trust no one, but verify.
Right.
Trust but verify.
Yeah.
So I
Multiply.
defined it. I got my slide. It's going to be in my deck. A design principle that enforces verification to establish trust.
And Paul, I got a question for you. If you're a small, medium business, is there something you can buy that will implement this?
That's a great question. I wish there was.
Yes, consultants.
I've heard that
Okay.
Zscaler, I've been told that Zscaler
yeah.
does
Yes,
it, but
a
it's really
therapist.
expensive and only for the big companies.
Yeah, and that is likely true, Sam. But going back in Security Weekly history, we had a sponsor that was a zero trust company. Now I can't remember the name of it. And the founders would come on the show. And they
Pre-COVID,
would,
I think.
and they would come here in studio, and they would show like hardcore examples. Like he would write Python code and show his product, and when you tried to do a server-side request forgery, it would go, that violates the zero trust policy that you set for it. That company got bought by Zscaler, and they call it ZTP now. Zero whatever Zscaler rebranded it to. And that is actual, at least the last I checked, actually implementing what we're talking about when we say zero trust.
Yep, this is what I've heard, but I've also heard it's really expensive.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Well,
that's probably
security is only for their enterprise and the 1%.
Yeah, the SMBs, zero trust is probably unreachable, but there's things that are parts of it they can do that aren't huge, like enabling the multi-factor, hiring an MSP to monitor for them, or something like that. Probably reasonable, but I don't know how much farther you can go.
So here's a philosophical question for you: is zero trust based on authentication, authorization, either, both, none of the above, all the above?
But it's not. It's device and human. Both factors are continuously checked.
Bullet 3 on my slide. Zero trust can be applied to identities, devices, and or network architectures.
Correct. So you want to apply them to all.
So for the identities, is it authentication? You are who you say you are, or is it authorization? You have the right to see this, or access this.
It's partly you are who you say you are, but also there's some validation of the device that you're on to make sure that.
I remember having this conversation with whoever.
This is like Beyond Corp. It's like Google's Beyond Corp concept.
Yep.
Is what applies to identity-based zero trust architecture, and then it extends it to if you like, however much you've proven who you are, and the device that you're on determines what authorization you have in the system. In other words, the base level is like Paul did XYZ and his machine is XYZ, and then Paul can log in. But now Paul wants to go access the proprietary source code that we're developing in the company. Well, now Paul has to provide additional levels of verification before I can then go access.
So there's also the idea of, there's a centralized repository that says, Jeff, you can access this application, then this application, and only those. So there's your authorization piece. That's a big lift for a lot, but it depends on how it's implemented. But some companies do that, others don't. Some, just by nature of having a login and password or the equivalent, you can get it in an app. But the idea is that it's tighter than that and more control and centrally controlled. So I can turn everything off and not leave my menu system open.
Sam, when do you have to drop? In half an hour?
Half hour.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, half an hour.
I want to talk about, because I think you were not a huge fan. I shouldn't say it that way. You were skeptical of large language models that can find software vulnerabilities.
Yeah. Yes. And Google has their
I appreciate
demonstration.
That
yeah, well, Google has their demonstration.
Yes. Did you read what Google? So I wanted to get your take on what you thought of, because being a skeptic puts you in a great position to look at what Google has done with nap time to big sleep, which we can explain what that is. But basically, Google has a model. They find software vulnerabilities, and they found a software vulnerability in SQLite.
Yeah, but they admit that they probably could have found it easier with the normal scanning tool. But the point is, they made.
I thought they couldn't find it with fuzzing.
No, they said
they couldn't find it.
They say they probably could have found it with any normal fuzzing tool at the end of the article.
Oh, okay.
But the point is, they are showing some progress. And, I don't see any reason why LLMs wouldn't be able to do source code scanning. It's just you're going to have to train them specifically for that. And I guess that's what Google's done.
Right.
I mean, just like they can write pages of text and have good grammar, they should be able to find suspicious lines of code that match a list of suspicious examples they've been trained on.
Right. So, and I think part of the thing was, although they could have found it with a fuzzer, it would have been taken a lot longer than the LLM took to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Which,
well, that's the idea, and hopefully this thing will be improved. Yeah.
Well, I think about it. There's we're with all the focus on software security, supply chain security, SBOMs, all that stuff. Making it less intrusive to find vulnerabilities in the code should help adoption, as long as it isn't wicked expensive to do so.
Well, Meta came up with the original model,
mm-hmm.
and then Google's nap time, which was named because bug hunters could take a nap while the LLM was finding vulnerabilities, which I think is hilarious. Mm-hmm. Google made a 20x performance boost. I don't know about the accuracy, but their big claim in nap time was performance.
Mm-hmm.
And then they came out with Big Sleep, which is the latest improvement that uncovered the SQLite 0 day.
Right.
So and I'm not sure what the exact timeline was, right? But like in not too long of a time, we've seen significant improvements over how LLM can discover software vulnerabilities. I anticipate, and some agree with me on this point, that we will continue to see improvements. When the day it becomes that we're all sitting around as developers going, oh yeah, like remember when we had to worry about software vulnerabilities and bugs that were causing security issues? Like, man, that really sucked. It's great to be in a day where there's an LLM right alongside me while I'm writing code and taking care of all those things. Sam's trying to jump out of his chair.
I remember Dark Tangent talking about how when they came up with the first IDS that looked at network traffic, they said, that's it. That's the end of security problems. It'll fix everything.
Right.
No,
and
this
now
allows us to focus on other stuff.
Yeah.
Just encrypt everything. That's all.
Yeah, exactly.
Encrypt everything will be fine.
The enemies are intelligent. Whatever you build, there will be a new attack that punches through it.
Right.
Build a better mouse, you build a better mousetrap.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things that was in the article when I was reading this stuff the other day is that they were looking for similar but unpatched vulnerabilities. In other words, there was a patch to SQLite that addressed the issue, and what they found was a similar issue in another part of code, not the same issue, but in other words, what is it? Because you notice how sometimes they get a patch and then immediately there's a supplemental patch because there's more to it and more to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that seemed like the problem they were focused on, which I thought was kind of cool because that, 17 updates to get the full fix, this really doesn't sit well.
I can see LLMs today being effective in that scenario you described, where they're basing it on the patch that already happened.
Yeah.
And then just running through all the different possibilities. And then one section of code that had that problem.
Mm-hmm.
What else can we find? So when you're applying a patch, have a much higher rate of success at fixing that vulnerability and all the variants of that vulnerability, because an LLM will help you with the variants. That's a likely where we are now or very soon will be much better at. And then I think it's going to take a lot more time before LLMs are really truly helping with classes of. I think it's going to probably be classes of vulnerabilities like memory corruption. Sam, to your point, like attackers are always going to find a way. Memory corruption is just one class of vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
So maybe there's a future where memory corruption in new code we don't have to worry about. We're squashing 99% of that with the help of LLMs. But that still leaves all kinds of other vulnerabilities.
The way you're describing it, Paul, it makes it sound like signature-based detection. I mean, it's a little bit fancier, but LLMs are only looking for what they already know about what we've already figured out right now. They're not.
I think it's informed signature-based detection. I think it is a variation of that, Jeff.
But it's a category. It's a type. It's a style. It's whatever you want to call it. It's not looking for something new and different.
Well, see, that's
Yeah.
the thing I think an LLM can add. I mean, a normal code scanner just looks for exactly these lines of code, and the LLM would be able to find similar lines of code that amount to the same thing to a much greater degree. So it should find, and that could be an improvement. I'm also really glad to see this kind of specialized LLM. I mean, the large language models like ChatGPT are trained on the whole internet, which is ridiculous. It wastes an incredible amount of processing time and training and computing time. Having something focused for just one job, like finding errors in just one language, would seem a whole lot more efficient.
None of us
Or-
have
or
issues
certain
with
bug
focus.
classes.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah,
what you're talking about.
and that's where I'm even so in LLM as a tool that we use as security professionals and researchers. That's where I'm coming down to. Like, I'm not asking the general models a question or help with something. I'm like, either I'm going to, have my own contextualized GPT or space, or I'm going to use someone else's. And a great example of one that I was using on Chat GPT was someone created a GPT for malware analysis and reverse engineering. I was like, cool. Someone's already spent the time to like contextualize that GPT just for looking at binaries. So I'm like, here's a binary. I'm like, tell me about it. And I just, I keep prompting it and keep prompting it. And I'm like, I think there's certificates in here. Can you go like parse through that binary and just find me all the certificates? And it's like, yeah, I can look for this begin certificate thing and let me try and do that. And then it's like symbol table, blah, blah, blah. Like I can't do it. And it actually told me, I felt like I was talking to someone. It was very strange. And it was like, well, I can give you like commands using like strings and stuff and show you how to parse that out manually. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, go do that. Like, don't I'm like, just do that. And then it gave me a whole bunch of commands on how to parse it out. And I was like, oh, I'm like, there's more than one certificate in this binary. I'm like, write me some code to go parse out all the certificates in this binary. Wrote me like a little bash script and I ran it. And sure enough, and it was even like, here's an OpenSSL command to verify that the data that you pulled out of that binary was in fact your certificate. And I pulled out like 20 different certificates from this thing.
Neat.
It was pretty wild. And again, I like reverse engineering is a specialty in our field, right? And there are people that spend, their entire day in IDA reverse engineering stuff. And much respect, that's awesome. That's not me. I'm like, I just want to know some interesting thing. I need to reverse engineer this because I have like specific questions about things. And LM was pretty useful for that in this case.
So, Paul,
I'm
what
just
product is
thinking,
that? Can I get a hands on it? Is it free?
So that it would, so I have I'm not sure if it matters, but I have the Chat GPT subscription, $20 a month, whatever they call it. And I searched if you go in the upper left-hand corner and there's like the GPTs and I searched in there for like malware reverse engineering and they give you a list and then it tells you how many other people have used them. And I try and go for the ones that are most used by other people.
Yeah.
And I selected one of those. And I thought it was pretty good. After I can send you which one I used.
Okay.
Sam.
I'd be interested in hearing about that too, Paul. So.
Yeah.
Any issues
Thanks
with
to
running into
whoever
stuff
created
they
that
don't
one.
want you, the limits on the GPT itself that don't allow certain things, or is you staying well away from those?
Well, so I wasn't asking it to create anything.
Mm-hmm.
I was asking it to analyze a sample.
So that
that I
into
had
that space.
Yeah, so it didn't flag any concerns because I was just like, tell me about what's in this binary.
Yep.
I think I even told it, I'm like, this is like known to be malware or in use by attackers, to give it some additional context. Like I'm not just analyzing any other binary. Like this actually came from VirusTotal. It was found in the wild in use by attackers, right? And it full well knew that.
Yep. Paul was asking the GPT to analyze a sample, saying, "Hey, somebody peed in a cup from a known drug addict. Can you tell me if this has drugs in it? Not, can you pee in a cup for me and have it be clean?"
Yes. And again, in this case, a trained, skilled analyst with IDA, Binary Ninja, pick your tool, Gidra, is going to be way more effective in all that. Because the other one I had was obfuscated in some way, and that's where it starts to fall down. But if you've got something that's not obfuscated or not even stripped, this one I don't think was even stripped. You'll have a good time. So I mean, there are some limitations to it, but again, just for like a quick thing, I thought it was super useful.
Mm-hmm.
Hey,
Let's see.
Paul, I got a story.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
So it's not very often that security and sports ball intersect.
Ooh.
Ooh. So my story, my browser's being slow. My story number 4.
Oh, my system. Yeah, okay.
My story number 4.
We're talking college football here,
College
Larry.
college football.
College football.
Yeah, it's not often that security and sports ball intersect. And apparently there was some accusations that the radios used between the coaches and the quarterbacks' helmets were easily interceptable with some folks that had a modicum of skill, and I'd argue a software-defined radio to capture some signals, and that the entirety of the conversations were in the clear. So all they need to do is intercept what is being the plays.
I just need a tuner.
Exactly. Software-defined radio to listen to the appropriate frequency and arguably recover those voice conversations. Now, the company has attempted to provide some fixes. There's some patches. Who knows what these patches do? Because I'm dubious about whether they understand.
Are they double dipping and also providing the internet service?
Could be. But so everybody's up in arms about it, and the college football groups are basically saying there's no real advantage to people listening into these conversations because one, the plays are all in coded language. Like they're not saying, "Hey, you go over there and you go over there." No, they're all using their own specific terms to describe that, which you just need to decipher. But if you listen to enough of them and you observe
decode,
it,
Larry, not decipher.
If you listen to enough of the plays and you observe what happens on the field, you'll be able to figure out what all this means. To Jeff's point, right? Decode, not decipher.
It's kind of too late. It's kind of too late though, because don't they change the?
If I'm on second base, I can relay the codes.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, arguably they do change it, but with what frequency do they change it? How often do they rotate their keys? Right.
And you only play every team only once during the season, right?
Yeah.
But in college is that true?
But even that,
yes.
Paul. But even if that's the case, Lee, you can go to any of these sporting events. You don't necessarily have to have your team playing them. You could go to other events, right?
You mean I could just buy a ticket?
Yeah. But
with a software-defined radio, and the game is recorded, so you have that. You could record that on your YouTube TV, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, but why don't they just
use the sporting world for stealing messages and stealing communications? I mean, that's been going on for years and years. Do they still have the big parabolic dishes up to capture the conversations from the other sideline?
Yep.
I think they mic up the players' helmets now.
Yeah.
They do. I mean, technology has made it a whole lot easier to steal the plays.
Why don't they just use
still
cell
doing
phones?
this when they're talking to not get their lips read?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So they were saying, all right, you're speaking a different language, and by the time you think you've got the message and you can decode it, by the time you go to relay it to the team on the field, the cutoff 15 seconds before the play has already happened. Like they cut off the radios, you're not allowed to communicate with them. By the time you decipher it, you're not going to be able to communicate it to them. I mean, yeah, maybe. I don't. Either way, one of the lines that come in here was really bothersome to me, and that they said, and I'm trying to figure out exactly who said it. It says the frequency does not broadcast all headset communications between coaches, which would be invaluable, but merely what one coach says to one player on the field, typically a quarterback on offense or a linebacker on defense, and only when the coach is holding the button to speak to them before communications is cut off 15 seconds before the snap. I don't think they understand how RF works. RF is a broadcast medium. It is not between one coach and one player. It is in the air, meaning
it's not point to point.
No, it is point to every
Kind of
point.
like satellite communications.
Yes.
Yeah.
And next thing you're going to know is you're going to tell me that the coaches are on one channel and the player and the coach are on another channel, and there's no way to listen to both.
Right.
They need
right.
to take Hedy Lamar's advice and do frequency hop.
So hopping spread spectrum. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So
Not Headley.
the other one that I thought was kind of interesting. They issued a patch to protect the communications, and I'm kind of wondering what they did here. And this is one of the ones I'd love to get a hold of one of these headsets or get some data about the headsets and do some analysis. Because what areas of the spectrum are they operating in, and do they require a license?
Right.
Are there any universities in Rhode Island where you could go to a football game?
Probably not of the level that are in the Big 12 schools.
Yeah.
Ivy League is nowhere close to Big 12, I'm sure.
Exactly. So, and to the point is like that I'm getting at, like, are they doing encryption? The big question is, what frequency ranges are these actual helmet microphones using? And are they Part 15 compliant, meaning 900 megahertz, 433 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz? Because those don't require any licensing. But as a result, you're supposed to not be able to do encryption on some of this type of stuff, which we ask about Wi-Fi encryption, right? So,
don't the FRS radios have some? It's not encryption exactly, but no, you're supposed to have a license for those. Never mind.
Yes. Yep. So if it's licensed, then we were potentially dealing with some different rules about how you can do some encryption. So I'm kind of curious about what they did.
If it's licensed, Larry, do they have to make a filing with the FCC that's public?
I believe so. Yeah. There's going to be some documentation around it for sure.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I mean, I think it wouldn't be hard to add some crypto or obfuscation stuff in there. I mean,
sure.
The problem is you're going to be playing
is it necessary?
Catch up. That's the question. Well, their answer at the bottom of the article is essentially security through obscurity, right? Mm-hmm. We're speaking in code.
Mm-hmm. We've got Navajo code talkers. You'll never.
I was going to say Navajo code talkers had a pretty good track record of that.
Yeah, they did.
And pretty good.
And I'm okay with that.
Didn't they have an broken track record, Jeff?
Oh yeah, no, they did not. The Japanese.
Unfortunately, there are not many of those guys left.
I think we actually just lost the last one.
I think so.
We're down to
like one.
Single digits under two. Yeah, 2 or under.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and not to go too far off track, but the Navajo code talkers, it was fascinating to me that the Japanese never broke it because, the first thing was they were speaking in their native language. So it was, a foreign language that the Japanese would have had to learn and figure out. That seemed to be the issue that the Japanese never were able to get beyond, because the code book that they use, I've done a presentation on sort of the history of cryptography where I have some information on code talkers. The codes that they used were that, they were using coded words to represent things like a battleship they would use the term, let's say, whale. And it was, whatever their Navajo term was for a whale. And a general was, big chief or something like that. It wasn't to me, it wasn't particularly complex in terms of the codes that they were using words to represent the things. It was pretty straightforward. It had to be the fact that the Japanese never learned the Navajo language, which is different from this, but still fascinating.
Before Sam drops, I wanted to cover quick an article about fuzzing, because I learned some stuff about fuzzing in this article. And Trail of Bits folks took to fuzzing the Z-Bar barcode scanning library. It's an open source library for barcode scanning. Did some interesting research to figure out if this had been fuzzed before. Like the OSS Fuzz project kind of maintains a list, I believe. Like it wasn't on that list. So I did some research to be like, no one's really fuzzed this library before, so maybe we should fuzz it. But then they had to do the fuzzing thing with sanitizers and fuzzing instrumentation, which when you compile it, you have to tell it like which types of functions that you want to fuzz, and then instrument the fuzzer to fuzz those particular things. So I learned some stuff about fuzzing. I apologize for horrible explanation, but they figure so. But then you have to compile the library with your sanitizers and fuzzing instrumentation in it. And what they said in the article make everyone chuckle. Like compiling someone else's project is challenging enough. Even more challenging to compile it for use with the fuzzer. And those who've done fuzzing is probably nothing new. But they said, fortunately, ZBAR is already packaged in Nix packages. So they modified the Nix OS, because Nix OS is kind of like FreeBSD ports, if you remember those, right? It compiles everything kind of on the fly. So Nix packages had like all the flags it needed to compile the library, and they just modified it to put in the sanitizers and fuzzer instrumentation. Sam, I don't know if you have anything to add there. I don't know if you've done this kind of fuzzing stuff before, but
No, I haven't. I know the Peach fuzzer works this way, and it's considered the best way to do it, where you modify the source code. But I haven't done it. I've heard it's easier than you might think, though.
right.
But I mean,
so like
they're
if you're into
absolutely
fuzzing,
right.
this is a. Go ahead.
They're absolutely right that you have to fuzz it. I mean, if nobody's fuzzed it, it's almost sure that you'll find new bugs by fuzzing it.
Mm-hmm.
Which they did. And if you're into fuzzing, you should totally check out the article because there's all kinds of nitty-gritty details in there. So
Yeah.
fuzzing is in your daily work, something you probably want to consume.
Yeah, I actually, when I first glanced through this, I got the attack vector completely backwards. I didn't realize they were checking the library itself as opposed to how to introduce issues with barcodes.
Yeah, they were fuzzing just the parts that consumed the barcode image and parsed the barcode image.
Yeah,
is where they were focused on.
how
right,
they
because
could be
that's the
influenced to
unstructured
change
data.
what they were reading.
Yeah,
which is kind of neat. And I hadn't. Yeah, that's just, I'm a little embarrassed I didn't catch that just at step 0. But it is actually makes it a kind of cool project.
So to translate, or to clarify, fuzzing is passing unintended or unexpected data. So if it's a QR code, you're sending weird codes or different types of barcodes or QR codes or different types of images just to see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Steganography or something.
To trigger a condition, right? And that's where the sanitizers and fuzzing instrumentation comes in that you compile into it. Is that you just don't want to, like, if you just fuzz random things and it crashed, then you got to go through the debug and figure out why it crashed. But with fuzzing instrumentation, it'll tell you like exactly where it crashed, and log that, so you can go back and what data made it crash and like make a log out of that to make your fuzzing exercises a lot more easy to determine. Oh, if I send this data, it crashes in this way, and this is the point in the code that was processing that data when it crashed, and then from there potentially develop an exploit from it.
So I'm curious because a QR code, when I'm scanning it with my phone, it's translating most of the time to a URL. Where exactly is the translation from the image to text, let's say, and where does the fuzzing come into play? Is it the conversion from the image to the text, or is it the thing that's processing the text where you give it unintended text to see what happens to it? Is the question making sense?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the second one. I mean, once you have it down to digital data, then you add some extra bits or move some bits around in it typically.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had another fun story that I put in Slack earlier. It was about it was like hacking at its finest. Cracking my story number 13, cracking into a Just Eat takeaway.com terminal with an NFC card. This was the most fun read. So this person, bye Sam, this person got one of these point of sale devices, I believe. Yeah. So they bought one of these point of sale devices that was running Android. And when you brought up this device, it had been like reset to factory defaults, and displayed a screen where you select the language and all that stuff. But this person was trying to get to the internals of the Android device. And due to the way this device was manufactured and shipped, it was not easy to break into the Android device itself. So they started by connecting a keyboard to it and using Alt-Tab to switch between applications. They got to an application where they could get into some of the app info settings. But in this version of Android, usually in Android, if you go into the app info settings, you can disable it, stop it, or run it from that screen. But this was like Android 6. And in Android 6, the app info settings are just disable or stop, so you can't launch it. So it was trying to launch the settings app so you can change the settings on it, turn some stuff off to actually access the underlying Android. And so that was a dead end. And then he started tearing apart the hardware and looking on there. And then he found some stuff on XDA, which is a great form for Android hacking. And from the chips, figured out there's an NFC reader on that. And NFC, I think we've seen this like with the Flipper Zero. You can put payloads in there that make it open, that make it do stuff like go to a website.
Yep.
There's like what do they call it?
Yeah.
It's like bad USB, but over NFC.
Yep. TNF or type name function with specific well-known names and numbers to perform specific actions with shortcuts.
So he programmed an NFC card that attempted to open an app, but then he ran some other stumbling blocks, but eventually figured it out. And you kind of parse through the article on your own. I don't remember all of the exact details. But basically, he programmed an NFC card that, when touched on the device, opened up an app that let him install a file manager app that let him break open the device. And did all this really just for the loss, which I love. Like, how do I get into the Android internals on this device?
NFC.
I go down a bunch of these dead-end paths until I realize that I can just flash an NFC card and then hit the thing, and it'll open up an app that gives me the functionality that I have. Just like hacking, like just pure hacking just for the spirit of hacking. I loved it.
Yeah, except for it was a point-of-sale device, right? So what you
This was a
said?
point-of-sale.
Yeah,
Yep.
so I wish he would have gone. Can we get in touch with this guy? I wish he would have gone further because, given that it's a point of sale device, there's some pretty specific things to go after. And I'm curious whether he could, what level of access he had to the things that matter on a point of sale device. Like, presumably there's some sort of encryption algorithm. There's mention of NFC. I don't know if it had the capability of doing inserting the card, a dip, but
right.
It's a point of sale system. So it piques my interest from a PCI perspective. And what was he getting at, and what could he get at? And if there's some sort of encryption on it that's encrypting the card data as soon as the card data is read, could he get to that application? I would love to see if we could follow up with this guy.
Yeah, he wasn't able to. So my guess would be that there's an Android app on there that does the payment processing, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
And he says in the article he wasn't able to get ADB debugger access to Android debugger. Android debugger, depending on if it's root or not, gives you certain level. So getting Android debugger running is one thing. And by default, that's like regular user level access to Android.
Right.
Which does give you some access to download applications off of that, but not all of them. If he gets Android debugger as root, then you can pull down all the Android apps and access all of the files on the file system. Some of those might be encrypted. Some of them might not be. But with root access, you have a better chance of unraveling it. He could have also taken off the spy flash of the device and taken a straight dump of the spy flash, which would give you access to the file system, provided the file system isn't encrypted. If the file system is encrypted, then there's other hoops to jump through.
I would bet you dollars to donuts that it's not encrypted.
Well, I mean, a lot of Android devices do have encrypted file systems. Even some of the cheap Android TV stuff that I looked at.
This was Android 6.
Yeah, this is old. This is old.
Android 6.
Does Android 6 have? I don't know if I messed
with it. He was able to see the whole file system.
What?
He managed
yeah,
to
so-
get
Mhm.
the.
But Lee, after that was after potentially post decryption and
Right,
or with
right.
authorized keys because they were using live system. But Paul, what's
Mm.
the current version of Android? 14?
Yeah, I think am I 14 on here? Yeah, this is an old
This is
Android.
Android 6.
Yeah.
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 So
More
but-
likely, even if it was some kind of encryption, that someone else has broken it.
Mhm.
That
Well,
being out that long.
I'd argue that it just needed a little bit more time to get full access to anything, given the age of the Android system and probably what vulnerabilities are available in Android to get ADB turned
Yep.
on, to get root access,
Oh,
to
yeah.
to
have
get access to that app,
full-
Jeff, that would process
full-
payments
yeah,
to
full
reverse
access,
engineer that app.
full
Yeah.
access to the system. It was just a
Right.
matter of time.
The one thing I'm remembering is Samsung's contribution to Android 6 was, and they gave it to everybody, was the encrypt file system libraries. So Android 6, I think, is the first version where the Android would actually encrypt the file system.
And now, is this a must or could?
Could.
It
But,
could. Depends on
yeah,
how you
I said
package
could,
Android.
but
Yep.
I'm just saying,
Okay.
if
The
I mean, if
capability
you were
exists.
them, I'd be turning it on, wouldn't you think? Well, then again, that's a big assumption. I said the A word again.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, Paul, what was the age of these terminals? Like, how old were they? Were they new?
You could probably
can't
tell
be
by the
new.
Android 6.
I mean,
Well,
If it's
well, I mean-
Android 6, it can't be new.
You know,
they could.
that
Well, no,
doesn't
they
mean
could
they
be.
weren't new.
They could be because maybe they started developing these, and it is how many years ago, and new devices are just using the old version of Android to move forward. And
The hardware might be new and the OS is not.
right, they could have also said, oh well, we hired an Android developer and they know Android 6, so that's what we're going with, despite the fact that it's wicked old.
I mean,
Well,
if you look at one of the photos, it's got some cool interfaces. I mean, we got 2 USB ports, a wireless antenna, and an Ethernet port. And apparently, underneath the covers, there's some UARTs you could play with.
And some NFC. How old is NFC? When did NFC start showing up in Android devices?
Oh,
Well, put it this way: if it's end of life, end of support, it technically shouldn't be used as a point of sale system. Although they do have some weird, legacy grandfather type clauses. If it's an existing system, they let you use it for a little bit longer. You can't just introduce a new system that's built on this platform. There's a lot of loopholes. Because people balk and complain about, well, we just invested all this money in this device. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could look up the takeaway TORGS SC20 PRT model and see when it was released.
But Jeff, I honestly, I love your suggestion. Can we get in contact with this guy and get him on the show?
I mean, when was the last time we did a text segment?
Yeah, who is Marcel and how do we get a hold of him?
Yeah,
this could be really cool.
Get him on
We
the
have
show
ways
for
to
an
track
interview.
people down.
Yeah,
If only we knew how to hunt people down. If we had some skills in that.
Yeah, MGD Productions, huh?
Hey, Paul, real quick, I'd love to touch a little bit of a fun story.
Yeah.
Let's see. My story number 1, I believe it was, to link to a GitHub repository for SatDump, and it is a blog post at satdump.org. Now, SatDump is a pretty cool application for using software-defined radio to capture images from various satellites, whether they be weather,
they're all weather satellites.
Earth orbit. Well, no, not necessarily. One of them is JUICE, the Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, that did some decoding of receipt of satellite imagery from and so forth. So amazing.
Wait, 3 of the Galilean moons of Jupiter.
Yeah.
I like that word, Galilean.
Kind
of sounds like something from Star Trek or Star Wars, right?
So
the Galilean race.
They
the
added
Galileo 7
tentacles.
Yeah, they added a bunch of support to doing additional decodes and fixes for a bunch of satellites. But I think the one that I thought was the most fun is that I think every GitHub release that you do on GitHub should contain the statistics section down at the bottom of this particular entry.
I'm scrolling.
And the statistics were number of commits named oops, 23.
I love it.
Number of commits insulting EU Metsat for some reason, 5. Number of commits asking for help because the author is held hostage by one of the other contributors, Lego 11, 1. Number of commits where Lego 11 was forced to work on this decoding algorithm by another contributor, also 1. Like, I think GitHub repositories should have these types of statistics
I love
with
it.
them for
Fun.
each release.
I like that you read all the way to the bottom too to find
I
the
did.
statistics. Yeah,
I
it's
did.
great.
And Paul, this was one of the ones I think that we talked about on the Eclipse podcast, where we had an application that actually backported this to Windows XP.
Mm-hmm.
This was the app. This was the app that
Oh, okay.
ported
Yeah.
did a test of backporting it to Windows XP Service Pack 3, and you're not going to get support for this, and there's going to be no future updates, and don't submit bug requests.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we did it because we know so many ham radio folks are still using
Still
Windows
running
XP
XP
because of
yeah,
the
hardware
software
and
they need to the software they need to use for their radio that is decades old still has to run on Windows XP and won't run on anything
Oh,
else.
interesting. It's kind of like a hospital or industrial control system or whatever, right?
Yep.
Oh.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's great.
I mean, my base unit I bought last year is so old it doesn't even have the ability to have the computer control, but it does have a VGA output.
What?
Yeah,
No
think it
computer
does.
control?
Well, I was buying it on auction and I was cheap. I would like to have gotten the 590 off the ARLX, but the price went up fast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of course, it sat for most of the week. It was the last couple hours, but it's like, no, I don't need it that bad.
I have a story that is probably going to trigger Jeff, but I want to save
for
that
it.
because we were talking. But
Yes.
before I get to that, I want to talk about 11.
Jeff,
You're
you're on
muted,
mute.
Jeff.
You're going to
There we
wait
go.
to trigger me? You've already
Yes.
triggered me.
It's right. It's a double
We go
trigger.
for the double trigger. Yeah.
Well, you know,
So my story number 11 is a deeper look into FortiJump, the Forti Manager Vulnerability CVE 2024 47575. I think the researchers that did this post deserve a round of applause for so many reasons. So they worked hard to set up a lab
Cheers.
environment. Cheers.
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 So they worked hard to set up a lab environment because you got to get FortiManager, but you also got to get a Fortinet device to talk to FortiManager. 2 devices. Got to get those communicating to each other. They got the protocol worked out, able to replicate that with a Python script. To go further down the path, they had to pull the chip off the hardware to read the spy flash. So, like, right away, we're not talking about virtual infrastructure. We're talking about physical appliances. Anytime you're pulling a spy flash chip off of a device, Larry, what's the rule and how many you need?
4.
Yes. Some number greater than 1. Right?
Some number greater than 2.
Greater than 2, yes. Because things might go wrong. So they pulled the chip off. They read the contents of the spy flash chip to find out that not just the firmware, but like the file system and the kernel had some kind of encryption in it. So like they couldn't get to any reverse engineering or file system analysis because they had to unwind all of this encryption. So they did that.
Cool.
They
That's
got
cool.
all the decryption figured out. Then they were able to diff the patches to find the vulnerability. Because up until this time, because I followed this very, very closely, we did not know what was there was no proof of concept for the FortiManager vulnerability. It was observed in the wild, but no exploit was found and published. So we didn't know like exactly what was happening. So they were the first to do the patch diff on it and figured out where in the code that was vulnerable. Turns out there was a system command, a system function call that was running a command based on some unstructured data or user supplied data. But ultimately, they weren't able, I should say, to create a proof of concept. However, Bishop Fox made the decision, hey, let's publish everything we got so far anyway. Like, who knows? Maybe it would have taken them months, any number of months to develop a proof of concept. But they're like, you know what? What we have right now, probably valuable to the community, so let's post it, even though we don't have a proof of concept. And I give them the world like so much credit for doing that. Because, like, I said, I followed this very, very closely. We did not know what was there was no proof of concept for the FortiManager vulnerability. It was observed in the wild, but no exploit was found and published. So they were the first to do the patch diff on it and figured out where in the code that was vulnerable. Turns out there was a system command, a system function call that was running a command based on some unstructured data or user supplied data. But ultimately, they weren't able to create a proof of concept. However, Bishop Fox made the decision, hey, let's publish everything we got so far anyway. Like, maybe it would have taken them months, any number of months to develop a proof of concept. But they're like, you know what? What we have right now, probably valuable to the community, so let's post it, even though we don't have a proof of concept. And I give them the world like so much credit for doing that. Because there are some that would read this article and be like, that's bull. Like, you did all that work. You don't even have a proof. You didn't even exploit the vulnerability. But what they published, extremely valuable to the community, extremely valuable to defenders, to other companies such as mine that are looking at this kind of stuff and trying to build solutions and detections for this type of gear that we typically have low visibility into.
Mm-hmm.
So just want to give a hat tip to Bishop Fox for doing that. And
Kind of cool.
Oftentimes you don't just get right to proof of concept and exploit. The work that they did just to get to that point is amazing. I mean, read through this whole post and you're like, good Lord, there was some really some bourbon being drank through this one.
I mean,
there was some walls hit, right?
I would argue also kudos to Fortinet for doing that level of implementation that required that much work to get to what they got to. And I'd love to think that was the case to across multiple of their products, because I stumbled across one the other day. Like, Paul, when I tell you, say, hey, Fortinet, what type of products do you think that they sell?
Fortinet makes forts.
Yeah, exactly.
Like pillow forts. Like you used to make a fort.
Exactly. Come on now. They sell security products like networking gear and firewalls and that type of stuff. I was at my kid's middle school the other day, and we're in their general pod area, and there's a VoIP phone sitting on the desk, and it's a Fortinet branded VoIP phone.
Oh yeah.
Like, I had no idea that Fortinet actually did VoIP phones.
Fortinet, yeah, they make like everything. They are a Cisco. I mean, they probably rival functionality wise and product suites with Cisco.
And allegedly secure VoIP phones at that too. So.
I like you say allegedly. Cisco just patched a bunch of their VoIP phones. I didn't put the story in there, but Cisco had patches for their VoIP phones as well. But I mean, as much credit as we want to give Fortinet for doing some security around that, some of their motives may not be to secure the product. Some of their motives might be to
prevent reverse engineering,
preserve their intellectual property.
That's good.
One could also argue that they should have programs that allow researchers the ability to evaluate this software in forms of bug bounty programs, in forms of partnerships where we could build detection capabilities, forensic capabilities, monitoring capabilities on this gear, which largely doesn't exist today. It's one of my soapbox items that I almost forgot about until you said that, Larry, that I wanted to harp on, given the Sophos Pacific Rim, given the not just Fortinet, but F5, SonicWall, Cisco, Avanti, and the list goes on, in all these vulnerabilities that attackers are going after, that largely we don't have great mechanisms or ways to provide the consumers of these devices with that telemetry. I think that's one thing that needs to change. I think Sophos kind of hinted towards it. Maybe we'll take the lead on this.
Yep.
To having partnership programs. Look, I'm not saying make everything available to the public. Like, I get it. But if you want to have some program where, like, we got to go some validation process. Once that validation process is complete, we get some level of access that gives us the ability to build some detections and monitoring capabilities for enterprises today. And or help discover vulnerabilities and audit things and coordinated disclosure of those vulnerabilities so they can get fixed before threat actors like the ones from China that we talked about earlier are acquiring said gear and have their own programs where they're not telling the vendors that these vulnerabilities exist. So those vulnerabilities in Sophos, they weren't disclosed to Sophos. They were disclosing internally to China. I think we need to change the script. Like, something drastic needs to change to enable this. That's one of my soapbox moments for this week.
Okay. Now
we got to trigger Jeff.
Trigger me.
My story number 17: Zery-Day FOMO, the fear of missing out on the next big exploit. The author says, with the rise in cyber attacks, the pressure to stay ahead of these threats is intense. This leads to what some call Zery-Day FOMO, fear of missing out. A unique fear among cybersecurity teams of missing out on detecting or defending against the next big exploit. It's a blend of excitement, pressure, and yes, stress, as defenders aim to stay one step ahead in an unpredictable game of digital cat and mouse. Is this really a thing? Should it be a thing? Why is it a thing? Thoughts, comments. Triggering Jeff. I use the word Zery-Day FOMO. What is a Zery-Day?
Well,
What is FOMO?
I started in this business back during the Cold War when it was all about cat and mouse.
Mhm.
So I'm somewhat inoculated to that concept.
I thought you started with it was like stone tablets and you had to chisel the IP address on them.
You know, he had to pound the papyrus flat, and then you could write it.
The token ring had to actually be physically carried from node to node.
You had to physically carry the token. Yep.
I never actually caught a token. I tried.
Yeah. But your bucket wasn't big enough.
It's a lot of fun. Now who's got the FOMO?
That's right.
Repeat the first two sentences of your article again. The part that talked about the what it is and the threat.
Yeah. So it says so the rise in cyber attacks, pressure to stay ahead of these threats is intense. This leads to what some call Zery-Day FOMO.
Mm-hmm.
First time I've heard of this term, by the way. They define Zery-Day FOMO as a unique fear among cybersecurity teams of missing out on detecting or defending against the next big exploit.
Right.
The exploit that has a name, a website, a song, a dance, and a logo.
Yeah.
I've yet to find a vulnerability that has a dance, though, and I just want to put that out there for the community. If you can check all the boxes when you find the next big thing, I want a name, a logo, a song,
a website,
dance,
and a website.
We are just not
to
invited
host
to
the
that kind of party. That's all there is to it.
That's right. I mean, then it's really a true vulnerability party, Lee, to your point.
Yeah. Wait, no, it's got to have a cryptocurrency associated with it too.
Oh, well, in that case.
Well, I guess my initial objection is that a Zery-Day exploit is, and I'm going old school, is that technically a threat or is that of an exploitation of a vulnerability? Because where I'm coming from, threats were people, the bad guys that were doing things, and I know it's more common these days that bots and exploits and malware and everything is the threat.
I thought the author did a pretty good job defining Zery-Day. So, Jeff, I'll read that for you.
Please.
In the cybersecurity world, a Zery-Day is a newly discovered flaw in software that hasn't yet been patched by developers. Since developers have had 0 days to fix the problem, it's called a Zery-Day vulnerability. Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty solid. Everyone agree?
Yeah, reasonable,
solid.
And FOMO is a thing. It's not. It's this is a specific case of it. But fear of missing out is actually a thing. I mean, I started looking for other versions of this article because of the paywall in front of it. But well, not a paywall, but an authentication wall, and that shows up all over the place. It's a real psychology thing, and it's kind of interesting.
But Zery doesn't imply that people don't know about it.
No.
What qualifies it as a Zery-Day is it hasn't been patched yet.
Yes.
So the developers might know about it. The public might know about it.
Threat actors might know about it. If anybody ever finds out I put that crap in the code, I'm in trouble.
Yeah, but there's just no patch for it yet. That's what defines a Zery-Day.
Mm-hmm.
Who defined that? Who decided that's the definition of a Zery-Day? Out of curiosity.
You did, Jeff.
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. So, I mean,
the interwebs might be able to tell us when the first instance of Zery-Day
I bet ChatGPT could tell us too. Can I tie ChatGPT to my Amazon Echo yet? Alexa, ask ChatGPT to.
Have you done that yet?
Nope.
Is that a thing?
I don't know.
I'm sure, it must be.
Maybe we should ask ChatGPT if we can chat.
Stop.
No, I will not stop, Jeff. Welcome to
Well,
the future.
So, of course, I asked the question and my internet froze, so I didn't hear anybody's response, but that's okay. I can watch the tape.
The
I
tape.
mean, most
You're just dating
the tape.
yourself, Jeff. Come on now.
I'm sorry. Well, nobody knows I'm not. I don't think anybody knows I'm not old. I guess. I mean, most of what we talk about, and we've talked about it this evening numerous times, even in the first segment, somewhat, is the idea of, it's the unknown. We track the known. We figure out signatures or ways to detect the stuff that we think about, know about. We're relying on AI LLMs to be a little bit more efficient and quicker in discovering the stuff that we know to look for. But the idea that there's stuff out there that's unknown, I mean, I don't have FOMO about that. To me, it's a given.
It's assumed that.
I mean, when we were at that venerable vendor that we used to work for, Paul, that was the time when some of the first major vulnerabilities came out. The Heartbleed and the WannaCry. Which one was it that was related to the Bash shell? Which one was that?
Shell shock.
Shell shock. I mean, it was a vulnerability that had been there in the Bash shell, from the very beginning, and it just took 20 years for people to find it. I assume that the stuff is there, and it's just has yet to be discovered. I don't assume that any new technology, any new solution, technique, approach is foolproof or secure or impenetrable. It's just
maybe
a matter of time.
But maybe that's part of the stress is we always know there's something out there that we don't know about.
But I guess I don't. To me, it's a given, so I don't stress about it. I don't have FOMO of like, oh, what am I missing? Although I will say, some of the best customers I've had over the years in terms of securing their network, their enterprise, the most secure ones were the ones that were like, well, I think I've done everything. I just don't know what I'm missing. But they were the ones that tended to be more secure because they'd cover everything. The ones that always fell were the ones who were like, oh, well, we implemented XYZ firewall and we went through the training course, or we did this, or we did that, so we're good, right? Or
do we have to take it out of the box and plug it in?
Drill a hole through the firewall and pass the cable through it. Our
there you go.
Traffic went through
Mike
the firewall.
Poor story. I can't believe that Mike Poor story holds up after all these years. I mean, I can, but
it's Mikey. Come on,
It's amazing how well that story held up.
I had a client years ago that had invested, several hundred thousands of dollars in ISS real secure appliances back in the early days of intrusion detection, prior to Snort and prior to Dragon, even. With a nod to our
NetRanger, or before that it was Wheel Group, right?
Yeah, Wheel Group, NetRanger were contemporaries, but Real Secure came about at around the same time. And I had a client that had bought four servers that were appliances that would deploy Real Secure. When I visited them, they were literally still in the box, and one of the boxes was being used to prop open the data center door because they were having HVAC issues. I'm like, that is like the ultimate misuse of a security tool. Not only is it in the box,
was Mark Mayfray the Real Secure, or no? Was he something different?
I do not know the origins of Real Secure other than it was ISS. And I mean, we're going back to the 90s.
We need like a whole podcast dedicated to hacker
heroes
history.
Hacker hero.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right.
Well, I mean, the talk that I've been giving all year has been sort of the third installment of my life story, but my time after NSA 1990s and the 1996 up until when I started doing PCI in 2004. So kind of the beginning of this whole industry, back when, all the vendors out there was like maybe 3 firewalls and 2 vulnerability scanners and 1 or 2 intrusion detection systems, and that was about it. A security conference back then would have not had a huge vendor floor, put it that way.
Right.
And I know we're wrapping up here, but Jeff, did you ever get a chance to, as part of that vendor space, take a look at the Crunch Box?
The Crunch Box?
Yeah,
I'm not catching your reference.
So it was a device by JD Crunchman.
Okay.
Or Captain
Crunch, yeah.
That was supposed to be like an IDS firewall type thing, all in one box, and like was touted as being one of the most secure and easily configurable type of things. And that was back in the day of the Mike Poor go to the vendor hall
that's
stands and bust the vendor.
Triggering. It's the most secure and easiest to deploy.
Yeah,
that's true.
But that was back in the day of the Mike Poor go to the vendor hall at Sands and debunk all and ask the vendors really hard questions they don't want to ask, type of thing. And there was apparently a bake off between some of these devices, and apparently that box did not last more than a couple of minutes with Mike Poor involved.
I didn't know there was a Crunch Box.
Yeah, and the irony is that there's a company out there now that sells the Crunch Box, and it's from Crunch Labs, which was, I think, the name of Captain Crunch's company. But they do it's basically like a hacker boxes type of thing, where they give you a thing for your kids to interact with and do some hackery type of things and build some electronics. And it's the Crunch Box from Crunch Labs. And every time I see it, I get triggered. No.
Well, on that note, I think we need to wrap up the show. I want to thank everyone for listening and watching this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over and baguette.